Well, I think part of it is the importance of viewing them as separate careers. I think there are some writers whose writing and practice in medicine are very much interrelated, and they write short stories about medicine or infused by medicine. Some of them are very talented. Perry Kloss comes to mind. Ethan Kanin comes to mind. For me, they're two very separate animals. And I view my occupation as being a bioethicist. And any extra benefits or extra blessing I get from being a writer, I'm very happy to have. But if it doesn't work out, I'm not devastated by it. And in some way, that makes it easier to do. I know that I can step back from it and go to the hospital and do my job, and I haven't abandoned something that's essential to my well-being. I don't have to earn a living as a writer, which makes being a writer both more interesting and more pleasurable. That being said, my wisdom to anybody out there who is thinking about becoming a writer, and what I tell all of my writing students, is that the vast majority of success as a writer comes from not just persistence, but relentlessness. I have recently reached the point where I now have more than 20,000 rejection letters. I don't know if 20,000 rejection letters is a record for people submitting to small journals, but it shouldn't be, because anybody else out there who wants to be a successful writer should also accumulate 20,000 rejection letters. The most successful writers I know, even those who are doing well, who have several good books out, still submit to small journals, still submit articles and reviews, get rejected, pick themselves up off the ground, and fight back again. Well, it's interesting. I did an interview a couple of years ago where 11,000 was the number, and I have a nice little journal where I keep track of every submission I've made. And if I ever do become a more successful writer, which is not guaranteed, but if I do, someday somebody will have my journal and be able to see exactly every submission I've made. Um, and I've gotten some horrifically discouraging rejections. I've gotten rejections that say things like, not only do we not accept this story, but please never submit to us again, or consider this a preemptive rejection of anything you might write in the future. And the way you deal with that, on the one hand, is to know that writing is very much a matter of taste. And once you have a certain number of acceptances, you can say to yourself, I know I've gotten 20,000 rejections, but I've also gotten over 100 acceptances, so somebody must like what I'm doing. And the other half of it is to realize that the same story that may be rejected by numerous journals or numerous periodicals can then be accepted, which shows that someone else shares their sensibility. One example I cite frequently is I had the honor and privilege of a story of mine called Shell Game with Organs, receiving an award from the Boston Review about a decade ago. One of my first significant literary honors, actually more than a decade now. It was rejected by more than 75 journals before I finally placed it, some of them rather unceremoniously, which suggested that it wasn't a shortcoming of the story, but simply a failure of the story to match the taste of a particular writer. I also urge people submitting stories to write a cover letter that convinces whoever the intern or college student first screening your work that you're somebody important enough that they shouldn't pass up on passing this letter on to the next stage. The story I always tell is I was once a screener. At one point, I worked for Congressman Ted Weiss down here in Lower Manhattan back in the 1980s, and I screened all his phone calls. And the poet Allen Ginsberg called to congratulate him on a recent election, and I didn't believe it was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, so I told him to write a letter and hung up on him. And about 10 minutes later, he called back in the congressman's private line, and I nearly lost my job. Your goal is to convince whoever has the role like mine at a literary agency that you're important enough that they have to get through to the boss. I think you have to have faith. I often make changes to the work based on acceptance. An editor who will call me and say, we loved your story, but we had trouble with the ending. We're still thinking about publishing it. Will you change the ending? Now that's someone who is invested enough in the story that I'm willing to say, maybe this person has a point and I'll go back and take a look at it. And often I will make changes. I think one story that comes to mind was a story of mine, Grappling, that appeared in Stories South a couple of years ago about alligator wrestling. And the editors there, Jason Sanford particularly, were excellent advisors who said, we loved your story, but you should really change the order of the scenes. And they were dead on. The advice I give young writers is never take advice from anyone who doesn't have a vested interest in your future. Once the editor says we might publish the story, they have a vested interest in your future. An editor who sends you a note that says we're not publishing your story and it's no good for the following reasons has no vested interest in you, so take their wisdom with a grain of salt.